the Diocese of Richmond, Virginia. The story of the faith in this region began with Spanish Jesuit martyrs, was sustained by the guidance of missionary priests and a holy seminarian, and carries on today under the leadership of its current apostle, Bishop Barry C. Knestout.
I always found the work to be fulfilling, to be something that was a practical way for me to express my love for the Lord and to serve the church.
This is the story of the bishops of America, the shepherds of the past and the shepherds of today, who through their callings and ministry carry the church into the future. It's also the story of their parish, their church, the Cathedral. This is The Chair, an exploration of what it means to be an apostle in America. Along the James River in the heart of Virginia lies Richmond, the capital of the Old Dominion state. It's also the sea city of the Diocese of Richmond.
The diocese is 200 years old. I think it's important that we recognize anniversaries because it requires of us that we reflect back on our history and our past, both the good and the bad and the challenges as well as all the opportunities, and to appreciate what has been the foundation of our faith and that all the patrimony that we've received. We have a large territory. We have 33,000 square miles in the Diocese of Richmond. So a lot of territory to cover because we're such a small community in the midst of a larger, now secular community, prior to that more Protestant community, that there has been and continues to be, I think, a good, strong sense of Catholic identity and a desire to express that and to bring that to bear on the environment around us.
Christian presence in Virginia does not begin with the Jamestown colony, as history would tell us, but rather there was a short-lived Spanish mission in the 1570s. We don't see the Catholics returning again for a number of years, at least until the 1600s, when Jesuits come down from Maryland trying to make inroads into the territory. But part of the challenge is that Virginia is very anti-Catholic at the time.
Colonial Virginia prevents Catholics from practicing their faith until 1786, when the Statutes of Religious Freedom are enacted by Thomas Jefferson. We see in the late 1700s a priest by the name of Father Jean Dubois, along with a few other French priests, arrive in Norfolk, Virginia. They then move on to Richmond, Virginia, by invitation from the General Assembly. He's given a room in the Capitol in which he can say Mass, so he becomes a very important figure in this new state of Virginia. Father Dubois befriends Patrick Henry. He serves as his tutor and teaching him French, and in turn, Patrick Henry teaches Father Dubois English. Father Dubois is a very quiet character, but in his quietness, he achieves extraordinary things in his lifetime. In 1808, he establishes Mount St. Mary's College in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And then in 1826, he goes on to become the third bishop of New York. While he's in the Richmond area, his missionary presence really helps to develop the Catholic presence in the Tidewater area of Virginia.
The Diocese of Richmond was established in 1820, and at the time it encompassed the entire state, including what would later become West Virginia. The Catholic population in the diocese was extremely small, centered around Norfolk, Richmond, and the area around Harper's Ferry.
I think there's always been, from the kind of even the founding of this diocese, there was kind of an independence. And so there was a desire that there might be a bishop named locally who could then kind of work with that community and overcome whatever the challenges were that were there. I think there's been a healthy independence, okay, which is that there is a self-reliance. There is a desire among those in our parishes to take responsibility for their own faith.
The first bishop of the diocese, Patrick Kelly, was an Irishman who never actually took up residence in Richmond, choosing instead to reside in Norfolk. He stayed in the diocese for only 1 year before becoming Bishop of Waterford back in Ireland. Upon his departure, administration of the diocese reverted back to the Archdiocese of Baltimore and remained under Baltimore's control for the next 20 years, a reflection of the small size of the Catholic population at the time.
The second bishop of the diocese, Richard Whalen, struggled to find priests to staff his diocese. He set up a short-lived seminary and worked to recruit the Jesuits to establish a college in the diocese. He later turned to Ireland in order to recruit missionary priests to work in Richmond. In 1851, Whalen was appointed the bishop of the newly established Diocese of Wheeling, and he was succeeded in Richmond by John McGill, who had the difficult role of leading the diocese through the Civil War.
During the Civil War, Catholics in the North tended to side with the Union, and Catholics in the South sided with the Confederacy. Since Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, it was a particular sort of hotbed of secession sentiment, and Bishop McGill was a firm supporter of Virginia seceding from the Union.
Bishop McGill held Southern sympathies and supported secession, even though he was a native Northerner. He granted permission for several priests of the diocese to serve as chaplains to the Confederate soldiers, and Sisters of Mercy and Sisters of Charity from the diocese worked to provide nursing care. Several of the parishes in the diocese were converted into temporary hospitals, and one even became a makeshift prison. The ravages of war would be felt in the diocese for years to come as Catholics struggled to rebuild. At the same time, the post-Civil War period offered new opportunities for the Church. To promote evangelization among the freed Black population, Bishop Kane invited the Josephite Fathers to establish a parish in Richmond. They later expanded their ministry to Norfolk and Alexandria. And in the 1890s, Catherine Drexel and her sister Louise financed the construction of schools for the Black Catholic population.
Louise Morel began a school for boys, really a military academy, St. Emma's, in 1895, and 4 years later, Drexel followed with St. Francis de Sales Academy for young women. That school was named after her father, Francis A. Drexel.
The Diocese of Richmond also benefited from the generosity of Thomas Fortune Ryan, who was one of the wealthiest men of his generation. He had made his fortune in transportation, tobacco, and insurance. And even though he resided in New York, he was a native of Virginia and remained dedicated to the local church. He was a convert to Catholicism, and his own faith was bolstered by the devotion of his wife. Together, they single-handedly financed the construction of Sacred Heart Cathedral in Richmond.
One of the interesting figures in the Diocese of Richmond, whose cause for canonization is now open, is native son Francis Parater, who was born in 1897. He was very involved with the Boy Scouts, having achieved the highest possible rank as an Eagle Scout, but he also finds this deep desire to serve God. He enters the seminary. In 1920, while studying in Rome, he becomes very ill with rheumatic fever and sadly ends up dying there. There's one story where he actually wants to get out of the bed to receive his last rites and is told he can't. We do have a little bit of his writings available to us, and I think for such a young man, his devotion and his desire to serve God is so spiritually moving. At one point towards the end of his life, he writes, "Every action of my life here is offered to God for the spread and success of the Catholic Church in Virginia. I shall be more service to my diocese in heaven than I am to ever be on earth." He's never ordained a priest, but clearly someone who is an inspiration as a Catholic.
Virginia's Catholic population began to grow in the middle decades of the 20th century, particularly in the post-World War II period. Under Bishop Ireton, the diocese would establish 42 new parishes and 24 new schools as the Catholic population grew to some 150,000, 4 times what it had been only 20 years earlier.
The Mother Church and spiritual center of the Catholic Church in Richmond is the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart. Thomas Fortune Ryan and his wife were the benefactors of this beautiful cathedral, and they chose the noted New York City architect Joseph Hubert McGuire as the architect. The cornerstone was laid on June 4th, 1903, the stone block coming from the Garden of Gethsemane. It was completed in 1905, and today, it's on the National Register of Historic Places.
We're here in a space in the cathedral that is used for our reconciliation room now. But earlier on, we had a stone that was placed here, a foundation stone, by one of our previous bishops, Bishop Keene. He had gotten this stone from the Holy Land, from the Garden of Gethsemane, and wanted to have something tangibly in this cathedral that would connect with the place where our Lord lived and walked and taught and suffered, died, and rose from the dead. And certainly in that Garden of Gethsemane where he experienced his passion and his call to be immersed in the sacrifice of the cross. That reminds us, as we kind of look up on the stone, and it's an identification here in this building, at this space, with our own Lord's passion, death, and resurrection, his paschal mystery. And so it's a reminder to us that each of us is called to also be immersed in that paschal mystery, and that just even as we die with Christ, we rise with him to new life. It's a real privilege to have this as a foundation stone that was placed along with the cornerstone at the same time.
The cathedral incorporates Virginia granite, Indiana limestone, and features a copper dome with a green unglazed roof. Though the interior of the cathedral features a Renaissance revival style, we see what resembles an ancient Greek temple on the facade. We see the triangular pediment supported by an architrave, a frieze, and beautiful Corinthian capital fluted columns. In the frieze, there's the inscription, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And this is drawn from John chapter 14. It's Jesus' last words to his disciples during the Last Supper, his kind of exhortation to them before he goes on to his crucifixion.
We are here at side chapel, an altar with the statue of St. Vincent de Paul here within the cathedral. St. Vincent de Paul is the patron of the Diocese of Richmond. He was selected or named as that patron during the time of Bishop Whalen, one of my predecessors here in the mid-1800s. This diocese at the time, and it has been for many years, a mission territory. So it makes sense that we would have a patron, St. Vincent de Paul, who has both an interest in and had an interest in the missions as well as care for the poor.
The large dome in the Sacred Heart Cathedral hovers over the crossing of the transept with the nave, and it's held up by 4 large pendentives, which are triangular supports to the dome. And on the exterior of these pendentives, there are decorative round medallions or rondelles that contain images of the 4 evangelists.
The chair here is fairly simple in design. It was simplified at some point in the history of the cathedral with some of the changes in the liturgy and some of the renovations that occurred here. And yet it still is a prominent and focal point. It has the coat of arms of the Diocese of Richmond on the chair as an expression of this local church's identity. It's a place for the bishop to preside over the sacraments and over the Eucharist, a place where the bishop and myself teaches and expresses that. So it's the priestly, prophetic, as well as the shepherding role is all expressed at that chair.
The chair inside the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart represents Bishop Knestout's role as the Apostle of Richmond.
I have 5 brothers and 3 sisters, also a twin brother. One of my brothers is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington. It's a big family, and I will always say that I'm in the middle of the boys. So 2 older brothers, 2 younger brothers, and a twin brother. I grew up in Bowie, Maryland. That's just about halfway between Washington and Annapolis, a suburban community. Spent most of my life there, and certainly formation and education, although there was a period of time, about 4 years, where my family spent overseas in Ankara, Turkey, because of my dad's work with the National Security Agency. We really didn't know what exactly my father did in terms of his work with the National Security Agency. He could never say anything about it, but that was work that was significant. He was a cryptologist. Bowie is not too far away from Fort Meade, where the National Security Agency buildings were located. My dad was a man of great enthusiasm. He was a convert to the faith. He was raised Episcopalian, and then in his college years, after some time in the Army, had become Catholic. And he was ordained 1975 as a permanent deacon. Later, he was asked, when he retired from the National Security Agency, for health reasons, he retired a little bit early. He was asked to serve as the director for the Office of the Permanent Diaconate in the Archdiocese of Washington. So for about 10 years, he was the director of that office, in charge of both personnel and formation, and working with Cardinal Hickey at the time. And then he called him the Archdeacon because of his work there as the director of the Diaconate Formation Program.
As a young man, Barry Knestout developed a talent as an artist. He studied architecture at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, graduating in 1984.
I would say that it goes back to when I was like first grade, and I won a poster contest encouraging children to brush their teeth. Okay, but it was kind of a silly little poster contest, but I was first grade. After winning that, I remember my sister asking me, well, what do you want to do when you grow up, right? And I said, I want to be an artist. And she said, don't be an artist. You don't make any money. She says, be an architect. I said, okay, I'll be an architect. So that was kind of the first, I remember, recollection of that. And that was cultivated over the years, and I pursued that. Later, I was discerning in my later years in college also a vocation to the priesthood. And so there was a pull and a tug in both directions. There are many ways to build a life of faith, and it can occur through that integration in a profession, a career, whether that's an artistic endeavor or an architectural endeavor, and it can occur other ways as well. And the Lord has called me to do it in a different way, and that has been in a very fulfilling life as a priest.
Barry Knestout was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Washington in June 1989. As a priest, he served in a variety of roles and ministries.
I always found the work to be fulfilling, to be a practical way for me to express my love for the Lord and to serve the church. Yeah, there were lots of times where there was lots of pressure, lots of stresses, but I never seemed to kind of be either preoccupied or overwhelmed by them. The Spirit always was there to provide a help and a grace that allowed me to always kind of be at peace and always grateful for what I was experiencing.
After years of ministry in the Archdiocese of Washington, Barry Knestout was named an auxiliary bishop for the Archdiocese of Washington by Pope Benedict XVI in November 2008. In December 2017, he was named the 13th bishop of the Diocese of Richmond.
There was a lot of familiarity with the life of a bishop in my experience, just because of the unique roles that I've had, assisting a Archbishop of Washington as a priest secretary, and then serving as a vicar general and moderating the Courier under another archbishop. There's kind of a intellectual knowledge of what it's all about, right? The experience is something different, because as an auxiliary and as one who was a moderator of the Courier, there was always kind of a way that you were in the background, because the one who shined, who was out front, was the ordinary, was the Archbishop of Washington. So my job was much more as to facilitate and to support and to help make sure the pieces came together in a way that's going to be helpful to the ordinary. Now, when you're suddenly now the ordinary, one in charge of the whole aspect, every aspect of the church's life, its sacramental life, its teaching, the integrity of that teaching in communion with the whole universal church, all of its aspects of governance and pastoral care, all those pieces of the work of the priestly, prophetic, and the kingly shepherding roles of the bishop. It's sobering. You start to realize the impact, much more to a greater way, the impact of decisions that affect personnel and that affect priests, that affect parishes, that affect the life of the church, that affect our own interaction with the community around us. So there's kind of a weight to it, or a kind of a gravity that is appreciated in the midst of that. As I was being installed and then being called to speak and proclaim the faith to this community that is now my responsibility.
In the years since becoming bishop, Bishop Knestout has worked hard to teach, sanctify, and govern his people.
For all of us as priests, but also certainly as bishops, that we have a responsibility for all three aspects of the identity of Christ, right? The priestly, prophetic, and the kingly roles. And the preeminent of those roles is the priestly, the calling to the people to offer praise, worship, and sacrifice in union with Christ in the Eucharist, in order that encounter might be an occasion of grace and a growth in holiness. And in that holiness, then it starts to then get expressed and reflected in the other aspects of Christ's identity that we're called by baptism to share and express, and the prophetic role. And I've always seen the prophetic role as being kind of a complementarity between a teaching, a handing on of the faith in a way that's integral and faithful to what's been received. And that's certainly what the apostles are called, and their successors are called to do, is to go out and to be sent to go out and to proclaim that faith, but also to do it in a way that's going to challenge people, to help bring them out of maybe a complacency or a sense that they can kind of go along and bump along in their faith, and that's okay. It's kind of good enough for government work kind of approach. I see my role more as trying to inspire within others a sense of the full life of faith that we're called to, the fullness of holiness and of love, and to do that in a way that's going to be expressive in an authentic way of the teaching of the church that I think in itself is beautiful and life-giving and transformative in terms of our mind and heart.